environmental triggers and demand pressure, causing flare-ups and autism-related catatonia and shutdowns. Autism-related catatonia, shutdowns, mobility and speech difficulties. So what exactly is catatonia? Dr. Lorna Wing in the UK was one of the first people to see an overlap between the features of autism and catatonia before anyone else did. Dr. Amitta Shah, clinical psychologist, and Dr. Lorna Wing have recommended a psychological approach which is based on their finding that stress and anxiety and side effects of psychiatric medication are the main causes of catatonia-like breakdown. Wing and Shah 2000 study. This is an individual approach which investigates the particular stress for the person concerned and addresses this based on a comprehensive psychological assessment and working with carers and local multi-disciplinary teams to implement a holistic plan. The main aspects of this approach include the following: assessment of the person's autism and their vulnerability to stress. This one, it should be part of any autism evaluation. Common standard. Really, it is so important. Regardless if there is a tendency to catatonic states or not. Most autistics have a tendency to go into meltdown or shutdown when feeling overwhelmed, and the best way to avoid such triggers is when you know what they are. Common sense, right? So, reducing and eliminating stress factors, which may include changes in the environment, daily program, increased staffing and support, etc. Identification of stress factors, which may include environmental, lifestyle and psychological factors. Early identification of possible indicators, psychoeducation to promote understanding of the condition, in particular to carers, professionals and service providers, providing verbal and physical prompts to overcome movement difficulties, searching for and eliminating any possible causes such as psychiatric medication. So usually when in public, I tend to go into shutdown rather than meltdown and have the meltdowns in private when nobody is around. But when I can't get away, then the result will be catatonia. In 2017, when I was invited to Belgium over the weekend to spend time with 3 lovely ladies that I had met in Glastonbury the same year, you would think that this was regulating, right? Little did I know. I wasn't really properly informed in advance what this weekend would be about, and I only realized later what I had gotten myself into. At the time, I really didn't know that I was autistic. I just knew I was an introvert, so I asked for a single room. It wasn't exactly that, but at least I had the bed to myself. Well, I also didn't know about trauma and somatic experience approach. So this weekend was deeply upsetting to my nervous system because there was no solitude, no breaks in between, where I could just be by myself. That so-called trauma work the ladies did, it had a new agey approach and was highly unprofessional, and there was no titration. Titration is a term Peter Levine, the founder of somatic experience, borrowed from chemistry. It basically means when you dive into working on traumas, you do it in tiny drops, little by little, and you get out again. You dive in, you get out. That way you don't get re-traumatized. This is a very safe approach. In comparison, what we did during this weekend in Belgium, we opened the floodgates. It was a highly charged environment for a whole weekend. For my system, it was just too much. We were taking turns in telling a painful story from the past, and there was a lot of crying, highly upsetting. They comforted each other. But for me, when I can't get away from people and have my solitude to recharge, I get into sensory overload and I go into a catatonic freeze. And that's like shell shock. And I don't interact, I don't talk, because getting the words out is very hard, because the brain does not function properly. I am totally brain fogged at this point, and everything is operating on a lower speed than normal. It has to do with autism, and it's not just trauma. And I don't move, I just sit there feeling this overwhelming inner sadness. And after that weekend was over, I was feeling passively suicidal for the whole month. It took that long to recover from sensory overload and come out of freeze response. Since then, I avoided to ever participate in something like this. If I ever take part in a workshop or training again, I would need to have my single room and no such intense direct personal interactions. I would want structure. And then there is the very important issue about my dietary disability. So I would prefer to cook in my own hotel room, have some very nice meat with salt and animal fat without any additional spices or damn vegetable oils. they give me migraines. So I would really need that type of independence. This is from a recent post by Dr. Veronique Mead. I will share the link in the description. It's a really good article. So she writes, I don't really want to write about shame and other difficult emotions because it means having to feel into these feelings. And as many of you know, shame in particular can feel annihilating. But the origins of shame are sneaky and we tend to think it's because something is wrong with us. The same is true for chronic illness. That's why I'm sharing more of my ME/CFS story, chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm starting to figure out at a personal level rather than at the cognitive level, as a somatic trauma therapist, that shame is something we learn. It's something that can get triggered not because of one or two events in the past, but from long periods of exposure in our childhoods or across the generations. My states of deep exhaustion and freeze at this biological level are much less than they used to be. As a result, these days I feel more of the overwhelming fight-flight-freeze in my emotion, which is part of what my physiological freeze state was protecting me from. It's been uncomfortable, to say the least. We heal this by attuning to our own inner child or little ones, with compassion, holding their hands, listening to their impulses, and honoring their needs. My shame can get triggered after I complete an interview for a podcast, after it gets published, or from the wish I had said a particular thing more clearly, which then overshadows the things I did well. Shame can get triggered from fear that others will judge me for not being articulate enough. Or I can fall into shame when I worry I may have inadvertently led someone to think I'm saying it's in their head. For myself, the big shame trigger is when I have made a mistake, or when I get angry. So I am very aware about why I feel shame, because I have been shamed when I got angry, when I made a mistake. From a trauma perspective, however, I could see it was also an example of why I had had such strong feelings of hopelessness and despair as a child and for a long time afterwards. A child's sense of self, self-worth, and value are shaped by mirroring, by being seen and accurately reflected by the adults around them. In addition to shame, my other difficult emotions such as grief, fear, and anger have also been influenced by childhood experiences. In trauma research, freeze is a well-known state that is understood to be normal, natural biological response to overwhelming circumstances when no other option works. It's not psychological, it's a nervous system response to persistent experiences of unresolvable threat or insufficient support to overcome those threats. When holding this very large context, to recognize that a person with symptoms of freeze is beginning to have core feelings, such as grief, joy, or anger. A trauma therapist sees how this may be a very good sign. Anger is a natural, self-protective mechanism that occurs when we feel threatened in some way, such as when our boundaries or needs are being pushed aside or overlooked. I have looked into PDA a while back and made some videos about it. I can relate to it very much. Christy Forbes explains the PDA brain very well, and this is a quote I like to add into this video. Understanding the PDA brain and demand pressure. It's a neurobiological response to our environment and its threat on our autonomy and freedom. The hypersensitive neuroception, neuro meaning brain, ception meaning that I receive from the environment, is alerted. So what happens is our amygdala is largely overactive in the PDA brain. This means we receive way more from our environment as a threat than the average non-autistic person. It is not about being in control, but rather our demand avoidance is largely driven by our inherent organic intrinsic need for autonomy and freedom, and not anxiety. Being in control therefore means I have autonomy in this moment. I have the freedom to choose for myself. That is what control is, having the freedom to choose for ourselves. Being controlled therefore causes massive anxiety and rage. We are born with this neurobiology. Trauma does not cause PDA, although the PDA brain in its structure is very similar to a brain that has experienced trauma. PDAers are born as beings who require more say over our lives. We have a very fragile neuroception. It's not just about our brain, it's about our neurobiology. The brain sends messages to our nervous system and body when it perceives a threat, and we are activated into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Let that sink in. I repeat this again because it is so important. It is not about being in control, but rather our demand avoidance is largely driven by our inherent organic intrinsic need for autonomy and freedom, and it's not anxiety. Being in control therefore means I have autonomy in this moment. I have the freedom to choose for myself. That is what control is, having the freedom to choose for ourselves. Being controlled or pressured into doing something we have not chosen ourselves, are unable to do, or that feels like a direct threat to our health, therefore causes massive anxiety and instant rage. In order to avoid flare-ups that result in migraines and fibromyalgia and feeling exhausted and very stressed or anxious, I need to adjust my environment and make it the least stressful possible. I'm still working on that. It's not easy. And demand pressure is one of the main stressors that really cause those symptoms. Now during lockdown, everything is fine, mostly. But whenever there is some demand coming from the company I work for, first reaction I have is instant stress and anxiety. Agency. I want to have a say what gets into my body. Therefore, body autonomy is very, very sacred to me. It is also a state with energy. When getting mad happens after seemingly inconsequential events, it is often a trauma response. An intelligent process in our bodies seeking to protect us and inviting us to take some kind of action. When there is insufficient support to learn how to process, integrate, and regulate difficult feelings, our bodies learn to suppress them as a way to protect us from overwhelm. Other feelings such as joy, love, and connection can get suppressed too. We know that the bigger the present-day reaction, the greater the likelihood that past event was not a single exposure, but one that happened through much or most of childhood. We know this as complex PTSD, attachment wounding, developmental trauma, or what I refer to as adverse childhood experiences. If you then look for context to the situation, it shows you that it is not a single incident or person that is responsible for the symptom, flare, or emotional reaction. These are triggers. The more we understand our triggers, the more we start to see how our symptoms, new ones, old ones, sudden ones, scary ones, seemingly unpredictable ones, mysterious ones our doctors don't know how to make of or do with, etc., do not happen out of a left field. They are the result of ongoing instructions from a nervous system caught in perceiving threat from certain events and experiences that are reminders of events going back years, decades, and generations. We are starting to understand that overt trauma can look like. The covert, however, remains deeply hidden. I now recognize origins of some of my flare-ups that happen when I visit my family. These symptoms reflect the body of the volcano that lies unseen until you have more eyes through which to see. Some of these patterns my body reacts to are alive in my family system. In my family system, children are a burden, children's feelings are invalidated, and children are supposed to take care of their parents. These systemic patterns have been influenced by multi-generational trauma. The patterns my body runs as part of a reaction to growing up in this environment include the following. My severe constipation gets worse when I visit family. This is a flare-up driven by a physiological freeze response. I have had intense, unexpected feelings of terror during visits and occasionally deep longings to flee. I've realized this fear is what I likely stuffed often into my gut as a child because there was nowhere to go for the connection I unconsciously craved and needed. I have had intense, unexpected feelings of terror during visits and occasionally deep longings to flee. I've realized this fear is what I likely stuffed often into my gut as a child because there was nowhere to go for the connection I unconsciously craved and needed. By the last few days of visits with my family, I typically don't feel like doing anything, contributing to a meal, setting the table, helping with the dishes. I just want to sit at my computer and scroll. This is a behavioral symptom driven by a physiological freeze response. I can include the biological freeze state of exhaustion, although this has been less intense in recent years. This is partly because I make shorter visits. Choice is one of the tools we gain as a result of the trauma lens. When I get back to my own home after a family visit, I tend to be emotionally disconnected. This is another expression of the freeze response. It used to be something David had to point out to me because these are old coping mechanisms. I was never aware I was running. It has sometimes taken me 2 weeks to come back into the present, into my body, to move through my feelings of grief or anger, and back into my ability to feel love and connection to myself and for David. With awareness and work with this particular symptom of freeze, along with shorter exposures, I now tend to recover more quickly, but I still tend to go into relative disconnection at some point during my visit. The way Veronique Mead is describing her experience visiting her family, I can relate to that a lot. 1. When I visit my mother, there is a lot of avoidance going on. I procrastinate. Before I leave my flat, I suddenly get busy doing this and that, not really wanting to leave. And often I arrive at my mother's around 4 p.m. 2. When I finally arrive, I already feel stressed out from the 2-hour train ride, so I feel rather irritable. 3. The strange thing is, I feel sudden sadness and pain in chest, lung area. Last time the pain was so strong I had to basically flee. I could not stand to stay 5 minutes longer. 4. As soon as I arrive at the train station, the pain in my chest, lung area has lifted, and I feel such relief, but feel drained when arriving at my own flat 2 hours away, and it's the same pattern every time. When I participate in a workshop where there are many people, I usually fall into a freeze response for 1 to 2 days after the workshop, feeling depressed and not wanting to do anything. That's basically me. And already during the workshop, I feel drained and exhausted. In 2013, I was very much into traditional Chinese medicine, and I wanted actually to learn acupuncture. I had already signed up for a training at a local school. However, the problem was I felt so extremely drained every time. After that one school day per week, I had flu-like symptoms, which now I know is actually fibromyalgia. So that one school day was too much of a trigger. The result was too much socializing will cause the same symptoms as exercise intolerance, migraines, anxiety, depression, myofascial pain, meaning muscular pain, and brain fog, and overall feeling drained. So I had to quit, unfortunately. I'm still figuring this out, because I really would love to participate in a somatic experience training, and I really hope that I manage to pull through it and not have those same symptoms. Again, it's the demand pressure which will result in a stress response. So how do you resolve that when your brain is wired that way? I'm working on my nervous system. This will certainly help with the trauma side of this, but then I'm still autistic, possibly PDA, and this is something that doesn't go away. Back then I was not aware I was autistic. Now I know, and I have gathered a lot of tools to regulate my system. But again, external stressors, demand pressure, that's no good. When I come home, already that will be regulating. My flat is a place I feel safe, and my nervous system recovers very quickly because it's the environment that is calming. So I usually watch a Netflix series like Outlander or X-Files, or dive into researching a topic, or watching YouTube videos. All of those things are deeply regulating and help my system to recover. After 1 to 2 days, the state of shutdown freeze lifts and I am back to my own rather cheerful self.
And if you hear my words and understand this, then you already know this. Well, everyone is equal, but no two equals are the same. I said that everyone is equal, but no two equals are the same. You need to recognize yourself, gain awareness, see your role and play the game.
It's the environment. When you have adjusted your environment to your autistic PDA needs, then you start to thrive. There is harmony.